Good evening, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about team modes and where the characters currently lie in their power rankings. I just got done grinding to Immortal over here in Season 3, so I feel like I have a pretty good idea of where the characters currently lie on the tier list in both duos and squads. So without any further ado, I'm going to get right into it, and keep in mind I'm going to be rapid firing these because there are so many characters in the game at this point, so don't be disappointed if I don't cover each character extensively. We're going to be going from the bottom up, starting with C tier, and keep in mind the order of the characters within each tier does not matter. The tiers are not ordered in any way, we're just going from C to S tier. Starting things off all the way in C tier is unfortunately just one character, and that's going to be Shoichi. Despite the fact that Shoichi has recently gotten squad mode damage buffs, he hasn't really found a home in either duos or squads. At the moment, he's a little bit better in duos than in squads, but that's mainly because all of his damage is single target, and he doesn't bring a whole lot of utility to his team in a team mode. But just because a character is in C tier or B tier does not mean that they are completely unviable. You can still have success on Shoichi, and some teams have, especially in duos, but overall, I feel like there are just a lot of better options. Moving right along, we're going to go straight into B tier, where we're going to find a lot more characters this time. Going character by character, I'm going to start with Sisela. Sisela is an interesting character because she's actually extremely strong in solos. She's a good character in general and feels like she would bring a lot of utility to a team. But here's where it actually doesn't quite stack up. In a team mode, Sisela's damage is just okay. And as far as her utility goes, she can only really lock down one target at a time. And additionally, her regen is not really much of a factor because against multiple people trying to attack her all at once, that regen is not going to nearly cover the amount of damage she's going to be taking. Additionally, Sisela's damage is so low due to duos and squads modifiers that she ends up being a pretty low DPS character in general, and since her utility is not that high in team modes, it doesn't really leave her with a whole lot. So she is pretty firmly in B tier. In duos, she probably could be more around the A tier, but I still don't really love the character that much in either duos or squads. Next up is Sylvia. Sylvia has been a pretty dominant character in both squads and duos in the past, but over time, with nerfs and changes to pistol and all sorts of stuff, Sylvia's just sort of fallen out of favor, and you really don't see her a lot anymore. Again, overall, she's just sort of mediocre to middle of the pack at the moment. Not too terrible, but also not that amazing. Next is Isol. Isol, similar to Sylvia, has been very strong in the past and is still a strong utility pick, but due to the fact that he lost his ability to put down more than one mock mine, it's actually up to 2 now, but even then, it's not as much as it used to be, he's kind of lost his place in the meta. That being said, he is still the best trap placer in the entire game, so if your game plan is more trap focused, he is an amazing inclusion into your team, but for the most part, he's just sort of niche to mediocre. Dylan is roughly on the weaker side when it comes to bruiser characters. You're better off with a character like Fiora, one of these other melee auto attackers that brings a lot of damage. Her utility also not that amazing currently in squads or duos, but she's not too terrible overall, especially more in the duo setting. Now, Sua is a hard one to place. I'm putting Sua in B tier even though I actually think she's A, maybe even A+ in duos, but in squads she's very underrepresented and pretty weak overall. She's not the worst character in the world, and she can bring a lot of utility and do things that pretty much no other character can do, which is both be a CC bot in addition to bringing a relevant amount of damage. The problem is just that in team modes, a lot of her setups, her knockups, all that stuff tends to not connect very well because you have to deal with way more people getting in the way and blocking a lot of her skill shots. A blind on an enemy through her W or a CC shield on one of her teammates is only so useful when you have more targets that you need to be locking down. Her E gets blocked. It's just kind of not enough, and that's what puts her a little bit lower on the tier list. Again, B tier does not mean these characters are not viable at all, just means that they're a little bit underrepresented or niche. Next up, Rozzy. Rozzy is not too bad, but doesn't really outshine a lot of the higher tier picks on this tier list, so overall she gets this mediocre point in B tier. And Aya, in a sort of similar situation, can do quite a lot with her AoE CC, which is actually very useful in team modes. She also is very flexible due to having 3 different weapons, both AR, pistol, and Sniper have their own uses, but none of them are really outshining anybody in the higher tiers right now. Aya is very underrepresented in general, and I don't really have much of an opinion on her because no one really plays her at the high tiers. And also similar is Nathapon. I actually think Nathapon can be really good in the right hands and can bring a lot of damage and utility, but not a whole lot of people are running Nathapon in squads. That being said, we did see some duos usage of Nathapon in the most recent ERCS, so I know that Nathapon can be quite good in duos. It's just that there's only a very small subset of players who are elevating this character whatsoever. Aside from that, pretty much no one is using this character, and he just seems not all that amazing, but in the right hands, Nathapon can be quite good, especially more in duos. So that wraps up B tier. Let's get right into the A tiers. Now, for all those characters in B tier to be down there in B tier, that's gotta mean that the rest of the characters in the game are really something when it comes to these team modes, and that's entirely the case here. So let's start off strong with Hyunwoo. Hyunwoo is kind of the staple tank of team modes. Between Hyun and Magnus, you basically have your choice of whether you want a more DPS focused tank or a more tanky tank focused tank. Hyunwoo is quite good in almost any composition as a frontliner, but he can also bring a ton of damage as well through the fact that his E is an AoE percent damage skill. Additionally, his ult can do a ton of damage, and if you run Tonfa, which most people do in team modes, you can be outputting a lot of damage simply by reflecting the high damage burst from your opponents, and since it is team modes, you get to reflect more than one character's burst if they're all bursting in a big team fight. Hyunwoo's utility shines in these team modes due to every single one of his damaging skills being AoE, so Hyunwoo naturally lands in the A tier. Next up is Kiara. Kiara is another character who's just barely not in that A+ tier. She brings a lot of damage and utility to the team. She becomes very tanky through the use of her ultimate and can have that really long range execute, which is really good for executing enemies who are barely getting away from the fight with a little bit of HP. She can secure those kills, and that utility is quite valuable. Additionally, she is such a powerful frontliner who can also defense shred for your entire team. That utility and damage and tankiness all in one package makes Kiara quite solid in that A tier. The only thing that's even slightly holding her back from being even higher tier is the fact that she doesn't really bring a ton of damage for your frontliner. Most of the really strong tanky frontliners in the A+ to S tier can also be bringing a ton more damage, or either that or a ton more utility. She's somewhere in the middle, which is sort of an awkward position to be in. Makes it hard to make her a super important pick for any specific composition, so as a result, she's just kind of lost in A tier, but she is very solid there. Next up, Yuki. All I really have to say about Yuki is that his ultimate is a gigantic AoE true damage percent HP massive nuke. I don't know if I said massive yet. This thing is insane in team modes, and as long as Yuki has this skill, he will always be in the A tier because a big coup de grace can swing an entire fight in your favor because it can half HP pretty much everyone it touches. Yuki, while not being insanely strong individually, brings that X factor through his ultimate, so he's pretty solidly in A tier. Zahir is a long-range poke mage who can bring a lot of anti-dive utility to the team through the form of his Vibe Astra, his Tornado. If teams try to chase onto you, you can use it defensively to kite. It's one of the best defensive kiting tools in the entire game. Additionally, his zone control through the use of his Q and his R, his Barg of Astra, ensures that it's going to be incredibly difficult for any team to fight on their terms against him. Additionally, that long-range poke does so much damage. Basically, Zahir is just pretty dang good as a mage in teams. The only issue with Zahir is the fact that he's a little bit squishy and a little bit hard to play, so you don't see a ton of him, but overall, Zahir is very solid. Kathy is really strong at the moment, and that's not necessarily because I think she's amazing in team modes, because most of her damage is single target, but she just recently got reworked, and it was a huge buff to her overall. So for that reason, Kathy is really strong because she is just strong as a character at the moment, but her team mode synergy is not that insane. It's not like she is, you know, one of these characters who's providing a ton of utility for her team, not really, but she is pretty dang good, especially more in duos where that single target damage shines a little bit better, but you don't see a lot of Kathy in squads. Overall, she is still really strong though, and this amp build is doing a ton of damage, so I'm going to be putting her in A tier. Alex has a ton of utility overall with that giant AoE taunt that lasts for what feels like a decade. Also, EMP Barrage is one of the best zoning tools in the entire game. Every team has to respect it. If it lands on your face, especially as you're being taunted into it, you have to reposition in that moment. If you sit there and tank it, it's going to ruin you. And that's why it's so powerful, and that's why Alex is actually a really solid A tier. Any character that forces everybody currently in the fight to reposition out of a place they want to be in is a very good pick for team modes, because it's going to be affecting pretty much an entire fight where everyone wants to dogpile on each other, and it gives you a safe area for you to be fighting in where the enemies won't necessarily want to chase onto you, so it's really good against melees as well. Alex's team mode damage has been nerfed a lot over time, but they've been starting to give him a little bit back into his kit, so I'd expect to see a lot more people running him in the near future, especially as Shuriken is quite good at the moment. Next up is Nikki. Nikki is a menace. Nikki can get on a target and stick to that target and be incredibly annoying, and also absorb a lot of damage through the use of her inbuilt parry. Nikki's routing is quite decent, and her damage spike early game is really strong, so this character overall is just super solid. The only issue with Nikki is she doesn't scale exceptionally well compared to some of the higher tiers, so unfortunately she is going to be down here in A tier. Now for William, our next character, William is in an interesting position. William's damage is actually insane. He's one of the only true sort of attack damage carries in the game, auto attackers from a range, and you don't see a whole lot of those in team modes. You see mostly amp characters in squads and duos, so to have a dedicated auto attacking range character is a little bit odd, but here's the thing. He's vulnerable to CC, he's vulnerable to dive, so you have to play him very defensively and play him with a team that can peel for him really well, otherwise he's going to get blown up and not do anything. But in the right team, in the right situation, and with good positioning, William is actually a monster. But due to all those vulnerabilities, obviously, I'm going to be putting him down here in A tier. Next up, Leon. Leon is one of my personal favorite characters to play in, especially in duos, back before he got his W changed, but with the change, he's been seeing a little bit less play. He was around the A+ to S tier before, but after the change, he's probably down here in A tier. You don't see a whole lot of Leon, but he still brings a lot of damage and utility to his team while being an overall obnoxious frontlaner who can also give you a lot of vision utility, which is not something we talk about a whole lot, but his Q gives him a lot of vision utility for your team and makes it really easy to bait out some nice engages if he duck dives onto an opponent who stands on one of his puddles. Overall, it's hard to rate Leon too low, as he does have really good utility and really good surprise damage for his team, so Leon is pretty solid in A tier. Bernice is the next character we're going to discuss here, and Bernice is an interesting one to talk about. Until recently, Bernice was pretty solidly in the bottom of the bottom tiers in pretty much every tier list, but he's finally gotten his time to shine within the last few patches. Mostly due to constant quality of life buffs to his auto attack and just damage buffs overall, Bernice has finally found a pretty good spot as a damage. I won't call him ranged because he's only sort of pseudo ranged, but basically a ranged damage auto attacker. His R, his explosive bullet, is one of the best pick tools in all of the team modes. It's one of the best engages in the entire game, and it can set up for a lot of really good picks onto vulnerable targets. If you land that from a range and you can follow it up with the rest of your team, that character's pretty much dead, and if it bounces even a single time, you've gotten so much damage and utility out of that thing, it's insane. Bernice, however, has no mobility when it comes to escaping enemy attacks, and that's why he's not any higher on this tier list. He's very vulnerable to dive, and he's very vulnerable to getting ganged up on by several people on your team. If you're against a Bernice, you just go, guys, go for the Bernice, and he probably was going to die because he can't really do anything to get away from it. He has to just get his damage out and hope that he did enough before he went down. So Bernice, as a very immobile damage dealer in the game, is probably going to be pretty solidly here in A tier. But enough about Bernice, let's talk about Luke. Luke is, again, kind of hard to rate in duos versus squads. I think in duos, Luke is in A+, maybe even going into S, where we had a Luke dominate the most recent ERCS and win the entire thing, which was a duos event, and made it look easy. Legitimately, Luke is such a powerhouse in duos. However, in team modes, since he is mostly single target, you do sort of see a fall off of Luke's abilities in squads. So as a result, I'm just going to be putting him here in A tier, but just know that he's actually a really high tier in just duos. And to round out the very large A tier is Heart. Heart can be played a variety of ways, but none of them really shine individually all that much, but the reason why she's still here in the A tier is because she has some insane synergy with some of the best characters in the game, allowing her to combo off with any character that has active damage while they are CC'd. So Magnus's Spin or Shukai's R, Burnt to a Crisp. Those two abilities synergized with Heart's Dancing R results in insane team mode combos, and you would be a fool to ignore them. So I can't put Heart any lower on this tier list. Individually, she's only okay. She's pretty squishy, and her damage is decent, but not insane. But with that utility comboing with those other characters, you have to respect her, and you have to put her in the A tier. So yeah, that's our biggest tier. That's all the A tiers. Let's go into the A pluses and see who we find there. So over here in A plus, we're going to be starting off with Fiora. Fiora is an interesting one to talk about, and you might not even really be thinking about Fiora as a powerhouse in team modes, but believe it or not, she is incredibly popular, especially over on the Korean server, as a diver and burster for team comps. Almost always combined with a Hedgen, Fiora ensures that her target goes down first as one of the highest single target burst DPSers in the entire game. Fiora in team modes is often played as a rapier character because that quick cut D skill on rapier ensures that she gets right on top of the target that she wants to be bursting, and you combine that with some solid CC on your team, and whoever she targets is almost certain to get bursted down. For the role that she fulfills, she's definitely in A plus tier. I can't put this character anywhere lower because no one really does what she does. Now onto our next character, we're going to talk about Emma. Despite the fact that Emma doesn't even see that much representation in duos and squads at the moment in the higher tiers, it doesn't mean that she's not that good. Emma brings a ton of utility, a ton of damage, and overall is just sort of a better version of Sisela. Especially with the recent changes to Shuriken, Emma's in a really good position right now, despite the fact that she does have some pretty heavy damage decreasers in squads and duos, but her utility being able to lock down an important target, point and click, not a skill shot, in addition to basically just good AoE poke and overall AoE damage, means Emma is a powerhouse as an amp poker. If you need an AoE mage for your team, you could do a whole lot worse than picking Emma. The only other real choice that you see picked a whole lot right now is probably Ava, and they fulfill a pretty similar role. So let's talk about 11. 11, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to 11, and I'm going to explain to you why I put 11 up here in A+, rather than up in S tier. I actually feel like she is borderline between A+ and S. If there was an A++ category, she'd be right in there. The thing about 11 is that her alone is not a team. And you could say, but Skaz, that's every character in the game. But yeah, true. But she doesn't necessarily do enough damage on her own in the same way that some of the S tier tanks do. But that being said, she is the best AoE tank in the game. She engages from a mile away and locks an entire team down with an instant 1.8 second taunt. It's the best utility in the game. It's so powerful, and on top of all of that, she is giving incredibly good food to her team in the form of those 11 combo meals. Those 980s are no joke. It's not quite Shukai food, but it's pretty dang good and fairly easy to make if you route for it. Overall, 11 is a powerhouse, and again, she really should be somewhere between A+ and S. It's just unfortunate that we don't have another tier between A+ and S. This character is absolutely insane, and you should try her out in your team. She goes in pretty much any team. She's really good. Now next up is Rio. Rio has been putting up a lot of results as a damage dealer in a variety of different styles. You can play her as a consistent ENAD attacker or long range and crit. Honestly, both of them are very, very good. I mean, heck, we've even been seeing some Amp Rio coming out lately that's been doing quite well. Rio in general is a solid range DPS, and if you need one that fits your route, a bow character, well, you could do a whole lot worse than Rio. Rio is very good. Now, as for Adela, Adela is also kind of along there with 11 in that A++ tier. She brings damage, she brings utility, she brings mobility, and did I say she brings utility? Because she brings an insane amount of utility to your team. One of the best things about Adela, in addition to everything I just talked about, is the fact that she is one of the best characters in the entire game at preventing enemies from getting revived, which is very important here in these team modes. That's why you don't see that extra value over in solos, because that revives don't really matter. But having a character who essentially locks down any revive from a range is incredibly valuable, and that's why Adela is so good, is that she has all that utility in addition to all of that damage. If you need a utility damage dealer, man, Adela is one of your absolute best choices, and she is so good. Again, A++ tier if I could give one. The biggest downside of Adela, if I had to be finding one at all, is the fact that her routing is not amazing. Rapier routing in general is not great, and Adela's rapiers are also just really not that great. A lot of the other rapier characters can get away with going with the ones that are easier to build, but Adela's are almost always just a nightmare to route, and as a result, it makes it hard to route with an Adela in these team modes. Next up, let's talk about Jan. Jan is a powerhouse, man. He's a solid A+ tier character who brings damage, utility, and pretty much everything you would want from a character on your team. His ultimate is one of the best engages in the game. It will lock a player in place due to that, 70% slow that it applies, and additionally, he just has so much damage and presence and tankiness that it's really hard to not respect the Jan when he's charging at your team. As a contrast to 11, Jan doesn't just bring tankiness and utility, Jan brings a serious threat of damage, and you have to respect it or your backline is going to get absolutely obliterated by this kickboxing man. So again, Jan, very solid A+ tier and very solid character overall. Now, Eva is very controversial. A lot of people say that Eva is broken. Eva this, Eva that, Eva, kicked my dog when I was young. All these things, everyone's really upset at Eva, but honestly, Eva is just a really strong character in team modes. It's not super unfounded, but she is very solidly here in the A+ tier because she has some very significant downsides compared to the S tiers. As for her upsides, she has a ton of damage in the form of her laser. That is the best skill in the game for just obliterating an entire team if you're set up in the right position. However, her major downsides come in the form of her pretty serious vulnerabilities to getting dove on top of. If you look at a lot of the S to A+ tiers on this tier list, you'll notice that a lot of them have insanely good mobility and really strong ways of jumping right on top of you and locking you in place, and Eva is very vulnerable to that. When Eva is allowed to play her game, when her team is able to dictate the pace of the fight and ensure that the enemies stay far away from her and all pretty clumped together, Eva is insane. But if Eva is getting jumped on by, say, an 11, like 11 on air, or a Fiora rapier dash right on top of you, or Jan just runs right up to you, there's really not a whole lot she can do to escape that situation, and she will likely go down or not get very efficient use of her skills in that moment. So Eva, in the right situation, amazing. Eva, when not in the right situation, very vulnerable. But overall, still an amazing pick for team modes. You should give her a shot if you need a long-ranged amp character. You could do a whole heck of a lot worse. And Lennox. Lennox is a staple of team modes for obvious reasons. Every single one of her skills is AoE. She has a ton of utility in the form of a whiplash skill that pulls or pushes enemies away. It's a giant AoE CC. Her W, it's a giant AoE silence that does damage and gives her movement speed. Also her pull on her weapon skill, one of the best utility skills in the entire game, one of the best engages in the entire game. Or you can pull an enemy off of one of your vulnerable teammates who are getting dove on. Lennox is a staple of team modes, for real. Like, anyone who's played team modes knows that Lennox is insane, right? She just has basically everything you would need. The only reason why Lennox is down here in the A+ instead of S tier is because her damage has been lowered over time to make her not quite the S tier that she was at one point, but she is still insanely good. If you want an AoE, CC, utility, damage, whatever, Lennox is a very good choice for you. And rounding out the A+ tier is of course going to be Magnus. Magnus is, well, he's just a solid hunk of a man. Wait, no, that's kind of weird. He's just a solid character to have on your team at all times. Magnus brings a ton of AoE damage in the form of his Bike from Hell. Even if you're playing a tankier version, it's still going to output quite a lot, and the utility on his E, the Heavy Slam, it's a really good long, I won't call it long range, but it feels like a long range CC on demand, instant stun against any wall that's nearby. Magnus is just a super solid character, and when combined with Heart, you get the Magnus Heart combo that is just, it's insane in the right hands. So Amp Magnus has a lot of uses as well as a niche combo character. Magnus is just very solidly A+ tier. He's even got poke on his Q. he's just good, man. Magnus is just a solid tank or mage for your team. And that's it for the A+. We got one tier left. I'm sure you can tell who's missing at this point. It should be pretty obvious if you've ever played a team mode. So let's go see who's in S tier. Ugh, I wish I didn't have to see them, but there they are. The 5 horsemen, harbingers, whatever you want to call them. In my opinion, these are the 5 S tiers in team modes. We'll go left to right as we've been doing this entire time, starting off with Jackie. Jackie, specifically Axe Jackie at the moment, is such a nuisance to deal with. It is such a pain. She has so much tankiness, so much damage, so much mobility, so much sticking power. She is obnoxious to deal with, and she is guaranteed to get a lot of value out of any situation as both a tanky and damage-dealing menace that just terrorizes pretty much everyone's backline. She can build almost full tank and still output an insane amount of damage due to the fact that her ratios are so good in team modes, and additionally, she has that axe skill that gives her a lot of HP back after the axe skill got reworked. So yeah, Jackie is insane at the moment. Give her a shot, try that tanky harp build. I'm sure you can find it somewhere out there in the recommended plans or something. Like, it's not a secret, people know about it at this point. Jackie is insane. Next up in S tier we have Nadine. Nadine's been a staple of team modes for as long as she has been in the game, and team modes have been in the game. Nadine played specifically as an amp carry, long range poke carry, is, well, she's S tier for a reason. It's insane the damage that she can output with both Bullseye after stacking up and funneling animal stacks from your entire team onto a Nadine, in addition to her arrow range just chunking people out from miles away. And here's the kicker with Nadine. Here's why she's more than just a poke mage compared to the other poke mages like Eva or Emma. With the Wolf Assault, after stacking a bunch of stacks on Nadine, with that Wolf Assault, she can outduel every single character in the game. So it doesn't really matter if your assassin jumps onto the backline and starts trying to kill the Nadine. As long as the Nadine's frontline is taking care of the rest of their team, the assassin loses that fight because Wolf Assault is going to be chunking for hundreds and hundreds of damage each auto attack, and she can kite really well with both Squirrel Trap and her Monkey Wire, and any bullseyes that get thrown out too are going to do an insane amount of damage. She wins those 1v1s. All these other long-range poke mages generally lose against any sort of assassin like Fiora who jumps on a backline, but Nadine wins those, and that's why she's in that S tier. Nadine comps are still incredibly powerful to this day, and Nadine is very, very, very firmly up here in the S tier. Plus, I already sort of mentioned it, but Squirrel Traps are insane utility for zone control in general. So yeah, anyway, Nadine's really good. Don't sleep on Nadine. Do I have to talk about him? Do I really have to? Alright, Shukai. Whatever, let's talk about Shukai. I feel like explaining why Shukai is strong is so pointless at this point because everyone's had to deal with it for so long. He's still insane in team modes even after his stacking got capped, but let's talk about it anyways. Shukai has one of the best ultimates in the entire game. It's an extremely low cooldown, massive AoE, defense shred, etc., that scales off of his max HP and all sorts of other stuff. It's an insane skill, it deals a ton of damage, and he gets a lot of utility on his kit just simply by making food. In addition to that, he makes good food for his team because all the food that he crafts heals for a lot more compared to every other food in the game. And Shukai is a problem in solos, but Shukai is even more of a problem in team modes because you can bring the food materials to your Shukai. You can funnel all these food mats into your Shukai and stack him up really, really fast. We've had people get max 150 Shukai stacks on day 2. It's not an uncommon thing whatsoever in team modes because of that funneling. As a result, you have an insane juggernaut beast tank frontliner with 4,000 HP who is also your highest damage dealer who gives your entire team really good food. This character is S+++++ and beyond tier, has been for forever, will be until they massively rework his kit, which I don't know if they're going to do anytime soon. So get used to him because he's there and you're going to have to deal with him. Or, hey, learn him yourself. He's really, really good. So enough about Shukai. You know why Shukai's good. We don't need to talk about him. Let's talk about Hedgen. Hedgen is, well, again, pretty obvious. We've seen Hedgen in team modes for pretty much forever. Hedgen has a ton of poke and damage and everything, on top of the fact that she has some of the best engages in the entire game and some of the best utility CC in the entire game, with the ability to fear, root, and massively slow an entire enemy team single-handedly. Additionally, she also uses shuriken really well because while her bow percentages are really nerfed at the moment in team modes, her shuriken percentages are actually still really high because it wasn't performing for a very long time. But with the most recent shuriken rework, well, I mean, shuriken's not even a bad choice on her anymore, and since the percents are so good, she's kind of just a beast still after all this time. She's an insane engager, damage dealer, utility, lockdown, escaper, best mobility, whatever. She's insane. Hedgen is just a absolute beast of a unit in team modes. And finally, let's talk about Adriana. The final character on this tier list, Adriana, has been, similar to a lot of the characters up here in S tier, a team mode staple for a very long time, and here's exactly why. Adriana does stuff that no other character in the game truly can do the same as she can. She has the longest range lockdown in the game. Cocktail Party is like a screen long, and it jitters an opponent away from the center of the cocktail, and if you can jam someone into a wall or jam them backwards, it's gonna lock them in place for just long enough for your team to catch up if you're chasing. So she has the best chase utility in the game. Additionally, since it is a CC skill, similar to Adela, she has the best revive denial in the entire game, which is a massive perk to a character here in team modes. On top of all of that, she has pretty dang good damage, even though it's been nerfed a lot over time, but it's still really good, and a lot of it is true damage, so you can ignore high defense characters pretty well, ignore their defense pretty well. Additionally, on top of all of this, she has really good escape for her team. Like we mentioned, that her Cocktail Party is really good for chasing, but on top of that, it's really good for getting away. If you're being pursued, she can ensure that characters on her team can get away from enemies from long ranges. In addition to those oil slicks and the fire escape slowing people and everything, she is just the utility character for squads, the utility non-tank for squads. And duos as well, but mainly more for squads because in duos she needs to be providing more damage since she's half of the team, but in squads, even though her damage isn't insane, she has so much utility, it benefits a team a lot. You combine her with a Shukai who is bringing a ton of damage and bringing a ton of tankiness, it's a match made in heaven. These two characters have been performing so well together for so long. Adriana Shukai is a massive pain in the butt to deal with. So yeah, Adriana, insane utility. And that's it. That is everybody in Eternal Return and where they currently rank, in my opinion, in both duos and squads. For the most part, the rankings are pretty similar between the two modes, but I mentioned some specific differences between them, so if you want to see all the specific differences, go back and check to see what I said, but for the most part, this is where all the characters currently lie on the power rankings in team modes, in my opinion, here in Season 3. Let me know what you think. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but for the most part, even if you feel kind of bad because a character you like to play is lower on this tier list, by no means, I'm going to reiterate, by no means does that mean that they are not viable or unplayable. Every single character in the game is both viable and playable. You just have to enjoy the character enough to play them and also find a team that works really well with them. Almost every character can shine in the right situation, so you just have to experiment with your friends to see what works the best. Oh, actually, hey, sorry guys, I actually forgot about one character. We didn't talk about Daniel. If I'm being perfectly honest, I think Daniel is roughly down here in B tier. He's not that amazing, but oh well. There's Daniel. He's in B tier. Doesn't bring a lot of utility, doesn't bring a lot of damage, doesn't bring a whole lot of anything, but he's got potential. And I just haven't seen anyone really bring it out yet, so we'll just give him more time, let that marinate, and check back in on it later. But for the most part, I'm just gonna put him in B because who knows. Anyways, for real this time. See ya.